candle went out. Not from wind, not from breath, simply from surrender. The wick had burned through, and in the study of Blackstone Manor, the Duke of Hartley sat in perfect darkness, a letter opener balanced across his palm like a surgical instrument awaiting use. He had been sitting there for 3 hours. Outside his door, the house party continued its tedious performance. Lady Ashworth's shrill laughter echoing up the servants' staircase, the distant thud of dancing in the ballroom below, the low rumble of men's voices arguing about grouse and railway shares. He had excused himself at 9:30, claiming fatigue. No one questioned it. No one ever questioned a duke. The knock, when it came, was soft, uncertain. He did not move. Another knock, more insistent. Then a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "Lord Pemberton, I've brought the documents you requested." Hartley closed his eyes. Lord Pemberton's rooms were on the opposite wing. Whoever stood outside had navigated. 3 wrong turns and a locked servant's passage to arrive at his door. He should not answer, should let her realize her mistake and retreat, should remain exactly as he was, alone, unseen, holding a letter opener in the dark, like a man who had not yet decided whether he was guarding something or preparing to destroy it. The door handle turned. He had forgotten to lock it. She entered holding a candle in a brass holder, the flame catching the copper in her hair. Not red, not auburn, but something, darker, like garnets held to lamplight. Her dress was plain charcoal wool, well made, but unfashionable, the kind worn by women who had money enough for quality, but not enough for excess. A governess, perhaps, or a widow. She stopped when she saw him. "This isn't Lord Pemberton's study," she said. "No." A pause. The candle wavered slightly in her hand, and he watched shadows move across her face. Confusion, then calculation, then something he could not immediately name. Not fear. Fear would have been ordinary. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Grace." She curtsied, competent but not elaborate. "Mrs. Ashworth gave me incorrect directions." Mrs. Ashworth gives everyone incorrect directions. It's her primary entertainment. The corner of the woman's mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that she too had noticed their hostess's peculiar cruelties. "I'll leave you to your—" She glanced at the letter opener still resting across his palm. Her expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature did. "Correspondence. I'm not writing letters. I can see that." Another pause. Longer this time. The candle flame bent sideways, responding to some current of air he could not feel. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mrs. Catherine Merrick. You're recently widowed. 2 years. Recent enough then." He set the letter opener on the desk with deliberate care. "What documents were you bringing to Pemberton?" "Legal papers concerning a property dispute. I serve as companion to his sister. She asked me to act as courier because she finds her brother tiresome and thought a neutral party might spare her an argument." Wise woman. Pemberton argues with gravity. Mrs. Merrick did not reply immediately. She was studying him now with the kind of directness that made men in his position uncomfortable. Not because it was improper, but because it suggested she saw past the title to whatever mechanism operated underneath. "You were sitting in the dark," she said finally. "I was. For how long? Does it matter?" "I suppose not." She moved to set the candle on a side table, then hesitated. "Should I leave it?" "Do as you like." She left it. The light was insufficient for the room, but it transformed the darkness from absolute to negotiable. Hartley found himself annoyed by this, though he could not articulate why. "What were you deciding?" Mrs. Merrick asked. "I beg your pardon?" "When I entered, you were holding that." She gestured toward the letter opener, as though trying to make up your mind about something. What was it? The question was so direct, so unburdened by social lubrication, that he answered before considering whether he should, whether to open a letter or burn it unopened. "Which did you choose?" "Neither. You interrupted me. Then I've done you a service." She said this without irony, a simple statement of fact. Indecision is harder than either action would have been. Hartley stood. He was taller than most men, a fact he had learned early to either weaponize or apologize for depending on circumstance. Mrs. Merrick, to her credit, did not step back. "You speak as though you're familiar with difficult letters," he said. "Everyone is familiar with difficult letters, Your Grace. The only difference is some of us pretend otherwise. Have you ever met someone and felt the ground beneath you shift? Not in the theatrical way of novels, where lightning strikes and orchestras swell, but in the quiet, geological, a way that precedes earthquakes. A hairline fracture you cannot see but somehow sense, as though your body knows before your mind does that the foundation has already changed." Hartley had felt it once before. 10 years ago, when he was still foolish enough to believe feeling such things was permissible. He felt it now, watching Mrs. Catherine Merrick stand in his borrowed study, her face composed and her hands steady, looking at him as though he were simply a man sitting in darkness rather than the 5th Duke of Hartley, whose family had held land since the conquest, and whose grandfather had been advisor to the king. "The letter," he said slowly, "is from my brother. I didn't ask. I know. That's why I'm telling you." He moved to the window, where frost had begun to pattern the glass in fractals. "He's been dead for 6 years. This arrived this morning, posted from Edinburgh in 1848, held somewhere in a solicitor's office with instructions to deliver it on today's date." Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of her dress as she moved closer. "What does it say?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it." "Why not?" "Because some things, once known, cannot be unknown." Mrs. Merrick considered this. "That's true of most things worth knowing. You speak as though ignorance is never preferable. I speak as though cowardice rarely is." The words should have offended him. They did not. Instead, he felt something close to relief, the way a bone, improperly set, might feel relief when broken again so it could heal correctly. "You don't know me," he said. "No. Then you cannot know whether this is cowardice or prudence." "Can't I?" She was beside him now, close enough that he could smell lavender and something else. Ink, perhaps, or old paper. The smell of someone who spent time in libraries. A man who sits in darkness for 3 hours, holding a blade, trying to decide whether to open a letter from a dead brother, is not exercising prudence, Your Grace. He's punishing himself for something. The question is what? Hartley turned to face her. In the candlelight, her eyes were darker than he'd initially thought. Not brown, but something closer to black, as though her pupils had expanded to consume the iris entirely. "My brother killed himself," he said. The words came out flat, factual. He had never said them aloud before. "Jumped from Blackstone Bridge into the quarry. They found him 3 days later. The inquest called it an accident because our mother begged them to, and because we paid enough for the privilege of that particular fiction." Mrs. Merrick's expression did not change. No shock, no pity, no performative sympathy. She simply absorbed the information as one might absorb news of a train delay. Unfortunate, but not surprising. "And you believe the letter explains why?" she said. "I believe the letter explains nothing. Suicide doesn't explain. It simply stops the questions by removing the person who might have answered them. Then why are you afraid?" "To open it? I'm not afraid. Forgive me, Your Grace, but you've been sitting in the dark holding a letter opener like a talisman for 3 hours. That rather suggests nothing, that you're terrified of what he might have said." The silence that followed was not hostile, but it was absolute. Outside, someone dropped a glass in the hallway. Laughter followed, then receded. "I failed him," Hartley said finally. "Whatever he needed, whatever precipitated his decision to..." He stopped, started again. "I was his older brother. I should have seen, should have prevented, should have known." "How?" The question caught him off guard. "How?" "Yes, how should you have known? Was he in the habit of confiding in you?" "No, but..." "Did he show obvious signs of distress?" "He was always distressed. He was William. He felt everything too much, thought too deeply about things that didn't warrant..." Hartley stopped himself, hearing the old irritation creep into his voice. The irritation he'd felt when William was alive, and that now felt like evidence of his own fundamental inadequacy. Mrs. Merrick waited. "He wrote poetry," Hartley continued, quieter now. "Terrible, overwrought poetry about death and beauty and the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. I told him to stop being melodramatic, told him to find a useful occupation, told him that wallowing in despair was self-indulgent. And was it? Does it matter? He's dead either way. It matters to you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to decide whether to absolve yourself or condemn yourself, depending on what that letter contains. Hartley looked at her properly then. Mrs. Catherine Merrick, widow, companion, woman who had wandered into the wrong room at midnight and somehow extracted a confession he'd given no one else in 6 years. "Why are you still here?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. And from the way she said it, he believed her. This story is a work of fiction, created for emotional reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. They did not open the letter that night. Instead, Mrs. Merrick sat in the chair opposite his desk, and Hartley stood by the window, and they talked about other things. Small things. The absurdity of house parties, where 40 people pretended intimacy while maintaining careful distance. The particular cold of Yorkshire in December, which was not the sharp cold of Scotland, but something damper, more persistent, like grief. The way widowhood functioned as social category rather than emotional state. How people treated her differently now, as though her husband's death had transformed her into something fragile and slightly dangerous, like nitroglycerin. "I'm not fragile," she said at one point. "I didn't suggest you were." "No, but most men do. They either treat me as wounded creature requiring protection, or as available territory now that I'm unclaimed. And which do you prefer?" "Neither. I prefer to be treated as though I exist independent of my relationship to a man, living or dead." Revolutionary sentiment, Mrs. Merrick. Is it? It seems rather baseline to me. The conversation continued in this vein, not light precisely, but not crushing either. There was an ease to it that surprised Hartley. He did not find conversation easy. Never had. Even before William's death, he'd approached social interaction as diplomatic mission. Smile at the correct moments, inquire about health and weather, deploy charm when necessary, and retreat when possible. With Mrs. Merrick, he felt no need for strategy. She did not require performance, did not seem to expect anything beyond straightforward exchange of thought. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she finally stood. "I should return to my rooms before someone notices I'm missing." "Will they?" Lady Pemberton might. She's insomniac and paranoid. A difficult combination in an employer. "Then you'd better go." But neither of them moved. "The letter," Mrs. Merrick said finally. "Will you open it?" "Eventually." "When?" "When I'm ready." "And when will that be?" Hartley smiled without humour. "I suspect I'll never be ready, but I'll open it anyway. That's rather the point of difficult things, isn't it? We do them despite readiness, not because of it." Mrs. Merrick nodded slowly, as though he'd confirmed something she already suspected. She collected her candle from the side table, and for a moment, her face was illuminated from below, throwing her features into sharp relief. She looked older than he'd initially thought, not in years, but in experience. The kind of aging that happens from the inside out. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Mrs. Merrick." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Catherine." She turned. "Thank you for knocking on the wrong door." Something passed across her face then. Too quick to name, too complex to reduce to single emotion. But she nodded once, and then she was gone, and Hartley was alone again in the study with the unopened letter and the memory of lavender and old paper. He did not open the letter that night either. The next morning brought frost and weak sun, and the usual chaos of a house party in its final days. Hartley appeared at breakfast, endured the expected questions about his absence from the previous night's entertainments, and watched Mrs. Merrick from across the room as she attended to Lady Pemberton with competent invisibility. She did not look at him once. He told himself this was proper, expected. They had shared nothing more than a midnight conversation about dead brothers and difficult letters, hardly the foundation for acknowledged acquaintance in daylight. But he found himself watching the particular way she poured tea, the angle of her wrist, the economy of motion, the way she responded to Lady Pemberton's petty demands with a patience that suggested not subservience, but conscious choice. After breakfast, he retreated to the library. The letter was in his coat pocket. He'd carried it there since yesterday morning, as though keeping it on his person might prevent it from becoming more real than it already was. He sat in a leather chair near the window and withdrew the envelope. It was ordinary, cream paper, his name written in William's distinctive hand, tall, narrow letters that leaned slightly backward, as though retreating from the page. The Edinburgh postmark was smudged, but legible. July 12th, 1848. 3 months before William died. Hartley broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded once. No preamble, no salutation, just text. James, if you're reading this, I finally managed to follow through on something. I imagine you'll have thoughts about my methods. You always do. But spare me the lecture about responsibility and family honor. I know what I'm meant to be. I've always known. The difficulty was never ignorance, but incapacity. I'm not writing to explain. Myself. Explanations require the belief that understanding changes anything, and I've never shared your faith in the corrective power of reason. I'm writing because there's something you deserve to know, and I'm too cowardly to tell you in person. The woman you loved, Miss Elizabeth Thorne, the reason she refused your proposal was me. Hartley stopped reading, looked up at the ceiling, where a crack ran the length of the plasterwork like a scar. Returned to the letter. She confided in me about her feelings for you. We'd become friends, after a fashion. I think she saw me as harmless, a safe repository for secrets, because I posed no threat to anyone's prospects. She told me she loved you, that she wanted to accept, but her father had gambling debts, substantial ones, the kind that destroy families. I made her an offer. I would pay the debts in full, anonymously, through a solicitor. The condition was that she refuse you and never contact you again. No explanation, no negotiation. Simply, refusal. She took the offer. Not because she didn't love you, but because she loved her family more. Or perhaps because she understood that loving you would eventually require watching you discover her father's disgrace. And she couldn't bear to see your respect curdle into pity or obligation. I tell you this not to absolve her or indict her, but because you deserve to know that her refusal was not about you, was not about inadequacy on your part or preference for another. It was about impossible choices and the particular cruelty of being poor in a world that punishes poverty as moral failure. Why did I do it? Several reasons, none of them noble. Partly because I could. Partly because I was angry at you for being better suited to life than I was. Mostly because I wanted to prove that your certainties were illusions, that the world didn't operate according to the principles you believed governed it. I succeeded. You withdrew after her refusal, became harder, more cynical. Exactly the kind of man our father wanted you to be. You're welcome. I don't expect forgiveness. Don't want it, honestly. Forgiveness requires belief in redemption, and I've never had much faith in that particular fantasy. I'm writing because keeping this secret has become exhausting, and I'm too tired to carry anything anymore. By the time you read this, I'll have been dead long enough that your anger won't have anywhere to land. That's cowardice too, I suppose, but at least it's efficient. Cowardice. William Hartley set the letter on the side table with hands that had gone numb. Across the library, a clock ticked. A servant moved in the hallway beyond. Ordinary sounds, continuing as though the world had not just reorganized itself into a configuration he no longer recognized. Elizabeth Thorne. He had not thought her name in years, had trained himself out of the habit through systematic discipline. Whenever she surfaced in memory, he redirected his attention to something concrete and immediate. Estate accounts, parliamentary business, the specific grain of wood paneling. She had refused him 8 years ago. No explanation, no softening. Simply, I cannot accept your proposal, Lord Hartley. Please do not ask again. He had not asked again, had in fact done exactly what William described. Withdrawn, hardened, become the kind of man who sat in dark rooms holding letter openers and contemplating whether some knowledge was worse than ignorance. And now this. The rage, when it came, was cold. Not the hot fury of immediate injury, but the deep geological anger of someone who discovers that the ground they've built their life on was fraudulent from the beginning. William had known, had orchestrated this, had watched Hartley suffer and said nothing. Except William was dead, had been dead for 6 years, and rage directed at the dead was like rage directed at weather. pointless, exhausting, entirely justified, and entirely useless. Hartley stood, sat down again, stood. Once more. What was he meant to do with this information? Find Elizabeth Thorne, who by now had surely married someone else, and tell her, what? That he knew the truth? That it changed nothing? That it changed everything? The door opened. Mrs. Merrick entered carrying a tea tray, then stopped when she saw his face. "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't realize anyone was here." "It's fine." But she did not leave. Instead, she set the tray on the table near his chair and poured with the same careful economy he'd noticed at breakfast. "You opened it," she said quietly. "Yes. And my brother was even more of a bastard than I'd previously credited." Mrs. Merrick handed him the tea. He took it without drinking. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. "No. Would it help if you did?" "I don't know." She sat in the chair opposite, arranging her skirts with unconscious precision. "Tell me anyway." So he did. He told her about Elizabeth Thorne, about the proposal and the refusal, about the 8 years of believing himself insufficient in some fundamental way, unable to inspire the kind of feeling that might overcome whatever objection she'd harbored, about William's letter and its casual destruction of that narrative. Mrs. Merrick listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" she asked finally. "Nothing. What is there to do? You could find her. Tell her you know. To what end? So we can both sit in a room acknowledging that we were manipulated by a dead man. That seems grotesque. It seems honest. Honesty is overrated. Is it?" Mrs. Merrick leaned forward slightly. "You've spent 8 years believing yourself inadequate because of a lie. Don't you think she might have spent those same years believing herself monstrous for refusing a man she loved? That kind of guilt doesn't simply evaporate, Your Grace. It metastasizes." Hartley set down the tea untouched. "You seem confident in your diagnosis of a woman you've never met." "I'm confident in my understanding of what it means to make impossible choices and then live with the aftermath." Her voice was soft but unyielding. "My husband died because I couldn't afford proper medical care. We delayed calling the physician because we were trying to economize, and by the time I realized how serious it was too late. So yes, I understand guilt. I understand the particular torture of replaying decisions and wondering whether different choices might have meant different outcomes. That's not the same, isn't it? Your brother put Miss Thorne in an impossible position. He did the same to you. You're both living with the consequences of his cruelty. The only difference is that you now know it was cruelty, and she still believes it was her own failure." Hartley stood again, this time moving to the window. Outside, guests were preparing for departure. Footmen loading trunks, horses being led from the stables, a general atmosphere of managed chaos. "Even if I found her," he said slowly, "what would I say? Good news, you weren't monstrous, merely coerced. That's hardly comforting. It's truthful. Truth and comfort are not synonymous." "No," Mrs. Merrick agreed. "But living with lies is its own kind of suffering. At least truth offers the possibility of resolution, even if that resolution is simply understanding." Hartley turned to face her. "You speak as though resolution is always possible. I speak as though it's worth attempting, even when it's too late, especially then." They looked at each other across the library, and something in that exchange felt like negotiation. Not of terms, precisely, but of possibility, of whether healing could occur in the negative space where harm had been, or whether some wounds were meant to remain open. "Come with me," Hartley said suddenly. Mrs. Merrick blinked. "I beg your pardon." "To find Elizabeth Thorne. I have no idea where she is, what name she goes by now, whether she's even alive. But if I'm going to do this absurd thing, I'd prefer not to do it alone. Your Grace, I can't simply—" "Why not? You're companion to Lady Pemberton, who treats you abominably and pays you inadequately. I'll hire you as my, I don't know, private secretary, research assistant. The specific title is irrelevant. This is madness, probably. But you're the one who suggested honesty was worth pursuing. I'm simply taking you at your word." Mrs. Merrick stood, and for a moment he thought she would refuse. would remind him of propriety and social boundaries and all the careful rules that governed interactions between men of his station and women of hers. Instead, she said, "When do we leave?" Finding Elizabeth Thorne proved more difficult than either of them anticipated. They began in London, where she'd lived before refusing Hartley's proposal. The house was occupied by a Spanish diplomat and his wife, neither of whom had heard of the previous residents. Inquiries with neighbours yielded nothing useful. The Thornes had departed suddenly in 1848, destination unknown, leaving no forwarding address. "People don't simply vanish," Hartley said, frustrated, as they sat in a coaching inn outside Bath 2 weeks later. "People vanish all the time," Mrs. Merrick replied, studying a list of names she'd compiled from parish registers. "Especially people with reasons to avoid being found." What reason would Elizabeth have? Shame? Debt? The desire to start over somewhere? Her father's failures weren't common knowledge? She looked up from the list. "Your Grace, if Miss Thorne accepted your brother's bargain, it was because she believed it was her only option. That kind of desperation doesn't produce women who leave convenient trails." Hartley absorbed this. They were sitting in a private parlour he'd rented for the afternoon. Propriety required at least the appearance of separation, though by now rumours had surely begun circulating about the Duke of Hartley. Travelling with his mysterious secretary, he found he did not particularly care. "What made you agree to this?" he asked abruptly. "Truly, you could have refused, should have refused. Yet you left your position with Lady Pemberton and joined me on this absurd quest without significant protest. Why?" Mrs. Merrick was quiet for a moment, still focused on the list of names. Then, "Because I'm tired of watching people punish themselves for things that weren't their fault. Because I spent 2 years believing my husband's death was something I could have prevented if only I'd been wiser, or faster, or less concerned with economy. And because someone finally told me the truth, that fever kills indiscriminately, that poverty is not moral failure, that sometimes we make the best possible choice and it's still inadequate." She looked up. "I thought perhaps I could offer Miss Thorne the same mercy." "Who told you?" Hartley asked quietly. "About your husband, a physician, Dr. Garrett in London. I'd gone to him seeking, I don't know, confirmation of my guilt perhaps. Instead, he explained in detail why nothing I could have done would have changed the outcome. That the fever my husband contracted was virulent and fast-moving. That even with immediate care, survival was unlikely." She smiled slightly, though it did not reach her eyes. "I didn't believe him at first. It seemed too convenient. But he showed me medical texts, case studies, mortality rates. Eventually I had to accept that I was not, in fact, a murderer, merely unlucky." "I'm sorry," Hartley said. "Don't be. Everyone is sorry." He recognized his own words, spoken back to him with gentle irony. Despite himself, he laughed. "You're extraordinary, Mrs. Merrick. I'm practical. That's not mutually exclusive." They returned to their research, but something in the room had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained, the proper forms of address, the absence of personal questions, had begun to erode. Hartley found himself noticing details he'd previously kept at bay. The way Mrs. Merrick's concentration manifested in the slight furrow of her brow, the ink stains on her right thumb from hours of writing, the fact that she drank her tea with no sugar, no milk, as though flavouring it would be excessive luxury. It was not attraction, he told himself, or rather, it was attraction of a particular kind, intellectual, practical, grounded in mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. But when she looked up and caught him watching, the expression in her eyes suggested she was engaged in similar negotiations. "We should try Somerset," she said finally. "I found a reference to a Margaret Thorne in the parish records from Taunton. Could be Elizabeth's mother. Somerset's 2 days' travel. Then we'd better leave early." They found Margaret Thorne in a small cottage outside Taunton, living alone with a housekeeper and 3 cats. She was older than Hartley expected, somewhere in her late 60s, with the kind of face that suggested handsomeness in youth gradually worn down by experience. She did not seem surprised to see them. "I wondered if someone would come eventually," she said. gesturing them into a parlour that smelled of lavender and damp, though I expected it would be creditors rather than dukes. "I'm not here about money," Hartley said. "Then you're here about Elizabeth?" "Yes." Mrs. Thorne settled into a chair with visible effort. "She's dead. Has been for 7 years. Fever. Same as her father. I buried her in the churchyard here." The words landed like physical blows. Hartley found he could not immediately respond. Mrs. Merrick, ever practical, asked, "When did she die?" "November of 1848, 4 months after we left London." Mrs. Thorne looked directly at Hartley. "She never told me what happened between you, only that she'd refused your proposal and that we needed to leave London immediately. I assumed many things. None of them correct, apparently. My brother interfered," Hartley said slowly. "He paid your husband's debts in exchange for Elizabeth's refusal. She agreed to protect your family." Mrs. Thorne closed her eyes. "Of course she did. Elizabeth always thought she could fix everything through sufficient sacrifice." She opened her eyes again, and they were bright with unshed tears. "I didn't know about the debts. My husband kept that from me until after he died, when the creditors appeared. By then, Elizabeth had already refused you, and we were ruined anyway." "I'm sorry," Hartley said inadequately. "Are you? Or are you simply sorry that you can't absolve her now that she's dead?" The accusation was sharp, accurate. Hartley felt Mrs. Merrick's hand on his arm, brief, steadying. "Both," he admitted. "I came here hoping to offer her truth, to tell her that her choice wasn't failure, but coercion. But you're right. That was as much for me as for her. I wanted resolution." "Resolution?" Mrs. Thorne laughed bitterly. "There's no such thing, Your Grace. There's only learning to carry what cannot be resolved." They sat in uncomfortable silence. Outside, rain had begun to fall, the soft, persistent rain that characterized the West Country in winter. Finally, Mrs. Thorne spoke again. "She did write you a letter, after she became ill, made me promise to keep it in case anyone ever came asking." She stood with effort and retrieved a small wooden box from a desk drawer. "I don't know what it says." She sealed it before I could read. She handed the letter to Hartley. His name, in Elizabeth's handwriting, similar to William's in its backward lean, but rounder, more hesitant. "Should I read it now?" he asked. "That's your choice, Your Grace." So he broke the seal, there in Margaret Thorne's cottage, with Mrs. Merrick beside him and rain drumming on the windows. "James, I'm dying. The physician assures me it's merely fever, nothing exotic, nothing dramatic. But I know the difference between illness and conclusion. This has the quality of ending. I should have told you the truth when I refused you. Should have explained about father's debts, about the impossible bargain your brother offered. But I was young and frightened, and convinced that silence was nobility. It wasn't. It was cowardice dressed as sacrifice. I loved you. That's the part I need you to know. Not past tense made safe by death, but present, continuous. I love you still, even now, even as my body fails in this cold cottage in Somerset, where I thought we might start over. Your brother was cruel, but I was complicit in that cruelty. I could have told you, could have trusted you to help despite your anger. Instead, I chose what seemed like the easier path, refusal without explanation, protection without honesty. I've had 7 months to contemplate that choice. 7 months of understanding that I didn't save you from anything. Not scandal, not obligation, not heartbreak. I simply distributed the pain differently. If you're reading this, I'm dead. And you've come looking for answers, which means the not knowing became unbearable. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I left you with questions instead of clarity. But I'm not sorry I loved you. Whatever else was failure, that was true. That was the one thing I managed not to compromise. Elizabeth Hartley folded the letter carefully, precisely, as though it might break if mishandled. Mrs. Merrick said nothing. Mrs. Thorne waited. "Thank you," Hartley said finally, looking at Elizabeth's mother. "For keeping this, for allowing me to..." He stopped, unable to articulate what exactly she'd allowed. "She deserved to be heard," Mrs. Thorne said simply, even posthumously. They left shortly after, citing the rain and the approaching dark. In truth, Hartley needed to be elsewhere, anywhere that wasn't that cottage, with its lavender and damp, and the ghost of a woman who'd loved him enough to lie. They stopped at an inn 10 miles outside Taunton. Separate rooms, separate meals taken in private. The careful architecture of propriety maintained even as everything else collapsed. But at midnight, Mrs. Merrick knocked on his door. He was not surprised to see her. "I thought you might want company," she said. "I'm not fit company tonight." "I didn't say good company. I said company." He let her in. They sat in chairs on opposite sides of the small fire, not speaking, as rain continued outside. Eventually, Hartley said, "I came here believing I could fix something, that knowing the truth would somehow undo 8 years of misunderstanding. And now I realize that some things stay broken regardless of understanding. Elizabeth made her choice. It destroyed her, destroyed me, destroyed the future we might have had. Knowing why doesn't make us less destroyed. It just makes the destruction more legible." Mrs. Merrick considered this. "Perhaps legibility matters more than you think." "Does it?" "I think so. When my husband died, I spent months in the dark. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Couldn't bear light. Couldn't bear clarity. The darkness felt safer because in darkness I couldn't see the specific ways I'd failed." She paused. "But eventually, someone lit a lamp, forced me to look at what had happened. And yes, it was painful, but it was also necessary. Because you can't grieve properly in the dark. You can only rehearse your guilt. So you're suggesting this pain is productive. I'm suggesting it's human. That understanding won't undo what happened, but it might allow you to carry it differently." Hartley looked at her across the firelight. "When did you become wise, Mrs. Merrick?" "I'm not wise. I'm simply practiced at being broken." The phrasing should have been melodramatic, but in her measured voice it sounded instead like statement of fact, like someone reporting weather. "Catherine," he said. She looked up. "Thank you for coming with me. For..." He gestured vaguely at the room. "The journey, the entirety of the past 2 weeks. All of this. You're welcome, James." It was the first time she'd used his Christian name. Hearing it in her voice felt like permission for something he could not yet articulate. She stood to leave, but at the door she turned back. "The wrong door," she said. "What?" "At Blackstone Manor. I knocked on the wrong door and found you sitting in darkness with a letter you couldn't open. Do you believe in coincidence?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. Neither do I. But I'm grateful for the error." Then she was gone, and Hartley was alone again, with the fire and the rain and Elizabeth's letter, which he would keep for the rest of his life but would never read again. They returned to London in early January. The journey back was quieter than the journey out. Not uncomfortable, but subdued. The weight of knowledge, Hartley discovered, was different from the weight of ignorance. Not heavier, precisely, but differently distributed. Mrs. Merrick continued in his employ, though neither of them maintained the fiction that she was merely a secretary. She managed his correspondence, organized his library, and occasionally accompanied him to public functions where her presence was remarked upon, but not scandalous. People speculated, of course. People always speculated. But Hartley found he had exhausted his capacity for caring about speculation. 3 months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday in March, he asked her to marry him. They were in his study, the same study where she'd first interrupted his darkness. And the proposal was devoid of romanticism. No flowers, no poetry, no declarations of undying passion. "I cannot offer you love," he said carefully. "Not the uncomplicated kind. I'm too damaged for that. And you're too practical to believe in fairy tales." "Agreed," Catherine said. "But I can offer you partnership, respect, honest conversation and companionable silence. A life built on mutual recognition rather than mutual delusion." "That sounds remarkably appealing, Your Grace." James. "So you'll consider it?" "I'll accept it." He had not expected the surge of relief. "Really?" "Really. Though I insist on one condition. Which is that we never lie to each other. Not the polite lies society requires, but the important ones. The ones that matter." "Agreed." They married in April, quietly, in a church outside London with fewer than 20 guests. No grand ceremony, no elaborate breakfast. simply vows exchanged, hands joined, and the mutual understanding that this was not restoration of what had been lost, but construction of something new from available materials. On their wedding night, Catherine found him again in his study, looking at William's letter. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Not burning it when you had the chance?" "No. Do you?" "Do I what?" "Regret knocking on the wrong door." She considered this seriously, as she considered everything seriously. "No, but I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd found the right door instead. If I'd delivered those papers to Lord Pemberton and gone to bed and woken the next morning with my life unchanged. You'd still be companion to Lady Pemberton. True. And I'd still be sitting in darkness. Also true." They were quiet for a moment, both contemplating the razor-thin margin by which lives changed. Wrong turn. Misread direction. Knock on door that should have been won over. "I'm glad you're a poor navigator," Hartley said finally. Catherine smiled. "I'm glad you forgot to lock your door." 20 years later, when James Ashford, Duke of Hartley, died of pneumonia at the age of 63, his widow found a letter in his desk drawer. Not William's letter that had been buried with him, placed in his coffin at his request, but something else entirely. A letter addressed to her, dated 5 years into their marriage. "Catherine, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're likely going through my papers deciding what to keep and what to discard, because that's the kind of practical task you approach with appropriate seriousness. Keep this, if only for a moment. I need you to know that what we built was not second best, not consolation prize, not the acceptable life we settled for after the preferred one became impossible. It was the life I didn't know I needed until you knocked on the wrong door. Elizabeth taught me about the possibility of love, about how desire could transform ordinary moments into something significant. But you taught me something harder, that partnership could exist without illusion, that two damaged people could build something functional and even beautiful from their respective wreckages. I did love you. I know I never said it. We'd agreed not to traffic in that particular currency, had decided our marriage would be founded on honesty rather than sentiment. But honesty compels me now to admit that somewhere between your knock on the wrong door and this moment, sentiment became unavoidable. You made life legible, Catherine. You lit the lamp and forced me to look at what had happened. And yes, it was painful, but it was also necessary. Thank you for being practical. Thank you for being broken in ways that matched my own brokenness. Thank you for accepting the man I was, rather than the man I might have been. I hope you find someone to knock on their wrong door. Everyone deserves that particular grace. James Catherine Ashford, Dowager Duchess of Hartley, read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in a wooden box alongside her own letters from that lifetime ago, and carried it to the fireplace. She did not burn it. That would have been dishonest, and she had promised not to traffic in important lies. Instead, she kept it, carried it with her for the remaining 11 years of her life, read it occasionally when grief became too heavy to carry alone. When she died in 1877, her niece found the box, read the letters with mounting fascination. This whole story of wrong doors and dead brothers and love that had been too complicated for simple categories. The niece kept them, eventually donated them to a university archive, where they rested for another 100 years, occasionally discovered by researchers interested in aristocratic marriage patterns or the social history of Victorian widowhood. And sometimes, very rarely, someone would read the letters and understand what they documented. Not romance, not tragedy, not any of the clean categories literature preferred, but something messier and more true. 2 people who met by accident, who recognized each other's damage, who built a life from available materials rather than imagined ones, who learned that resolution and healing were not synonymous, but that carrying knowledge with company was better than carrying ignorance alone, who knocked on wrong doors and were grateful for the error. That, the letters suggested, was perhaps the best any of us could hope for. Not the life we imagined, but the life we managed to build from what remained after imagination failed. And that, complicated, imperfect, deeply human, was enough.